The Fat of the Land by Wilhelm Stephenson. Chapter 12. Pemmican in Transition. The last chapter saw Pemmican near the top of the social ladder, with the magnates of the Beaver Club, pioneers of big business in the New World, fetching it from remote prairies, at great cost, to be the chief dish at their banquets. Nostalgia for youthful days on the frontier was no doubt at the back of their longing for the bread of the wilderness, but at least the association with it must have been pleasant in their memories, or they would not have longed for it. And it must have tasted good, even amid delicacies imported from Europe, or they would not have maintained its dominance at their sumptuous dinners. But pemmican is not by nature a mere delicacy like caviar. More nearly, it is a richer, more compact roast beef. There was no great future in its use at banquets, since it belongs in the class of staples. The need for it in the fur trade grew less as roads and railways were built that brought in cheap foods at low transportation costs, and took furs to market at an equally cheap rate. The traders were businessmen, and, though they might pay at a high rate for a little pemmican for their own delectation, they would see to it that their staves, and particularly their laborers, ate the cheaper meats, fresh or salted. There was coming along a small-scale use in polar exploration and ballooning, and there were sportsmen who felt they needed condensed rations on hunting or mountain-climbing expeditions. Only one possibility of a grand-scale need was on the horizon: military outfitting. War is a natural market for provisions that are nourishing and wholesome, and which have in addition the qualities of being light, compact, easily preserved, and easily prepared. Or, best of all, like pemmican, demanding no preparation, but still well suited to be an ingredient in cooked dishes where circumstances allow. Military requirements did not, however, seem likely to open a large market, for the period during which roads and railways were destroying the North American frontier market for concentrated foods was also a time of peace. In this country the rebellion was 10 years in the background, and men were feeling confident that there would not be another civil war in the United States. Throughout the world, or at least throughout the white man's world, prevailed the feeling that wars were an anachronism, and there was confidence that we were moving steadily toward an era of brotherhood. The spread of Christianity was to create a universal love of man for his fellow. That didn't exactly work out. The suitability of pemmican as a military ration did not, then, promise a market to justify its routine industrial production by the meat packers. No doubt those of them who were familiar with pemmican kept it in the back of their minds, during the 80s and 90s of last century, that if a war came they could readily turn their facilities to the manufacture of this concentrated ration. For a while the utopians seemed right. Wars were few and small, and some of them, like the Russo-Japanese, were far away from where pemmican had been known, and, partly through being short, these remote wars did not develop any large market for concentrated foods. There were mobile campaigns in which pemmican would have been useful, and in one of these, the Boer War, pemmican was indeed used, as was also the South African biltong, similar to the jerky of the American Indian. The high local reputation and the convenience of local production led Brit and Boer alike to the use of biltong, a fact that has long been known. That pemmican also was used is less well known. Indeed, the news that it was a standby ration is likely to come as a surprise to most students of the Boer campaigns. For testimony as to its use we are indebted to that able and colorful soldier and explorer, Major Frederick Russell Burnham, who served in the Boer War as Chief of Scouts of the British Army in the field, a post for which he was eminently qualified. In the 1880s he had been a cowboy, miner, and guide in the western United States, and had acted as scout in the Arizona campaigns against the Apaches. During the 5-year period of 1893 to 1898, he combined exploration of Rhodesia with military scouting for the British forces in the Matabele War. From Africa he went north for 2 years to operate gold mines in Alaska and the Klondike, whence he was summoned in 1900 by Lord Roberts for the Boer campaign. In his book, Scouting on 2 Continents, New York, 1927, Burnham says of pemmican, quote, "In the north, the great standby of Indians and trappers is pemmican. This is dried meat, finely powdered and put up in animal fat. In the Boer War, the iron ration given us was made of 4 ounces of pemmican and 4 ounces of chocolate and sugar. On this a man could march 36 hours before he began to drop from hunger." End quote. In response to a letter asking for further details of Major Burnham's experience with pemmican, Mrs. Burnham kindly replied on his behalf on September 9, 1945, prefacing the information about the Boer War with the remark that the Major could, quote, "cite reams of instances of pemmican's use during his many treks." End quote. Of his African experience, Mrs. Burnham says, quote, "The Major states that in Africa they used biltong in all of its forms, but that it is not generally known that the iron ration which they used in the Boer War was pemmican, and was the last ration which was pulled, and only then when ordered by the commanding officer. The ration was prepared in 2 small tins soldered together, which were fastened inside the soldiers' belts, and composed of 4 ounces of equal amounts of chocolate and sugar in 1 tin, and pemmican in the other tin, also 4 ounces. This ration was supposed to maintain full vitality for 36 hours, and from some of his own experiences the claim was justified." End quote. The feeling of the Canadian soldiers who participated in the Boer War that pemmican proved a good ration in Africa shall be documented presently in a quotation from their chief in that campaign, General Steele. In the long run, the utopians proved wrong about war markets. Wars, it turned out, were destined to grow bigger, and 2 large ones were destined to occur in quick succession. The need for a compact military ration developed not merely through the great numbers of combatants involved in World Wars I and II, but still more through a new transportation device, the airplane, which could travel so fast that its speed made up in part for its drawbacks as the carrier of heavy loads. Through air freighting there grew up a sudden and special need for compact foods, the very need that pemmican had been invented to fill. Today it is being said that if there is a 3rd World War, the need for concentrated foods is going to be even greater. This is implied, for instance, by the statement of Lord Swinton, head of the British delegation to the Air Congress of 1944 in Chicago, where he said that if there is another war, the troops for an invasion will not come by sea. They will come instead by air. If troops move by plane, their food will also, meaning that heavy weight and large bulk are going to be such drawbacks as they never were before, if there is a World War III. In the lull that has come after World War II, the statesmen and soldiers of the powers are saying to each other and to the public, with the greatest amity and amiability, that the United States intends to maintain a high pitch of military strength to safeguard the peace of the world, that the Union of Soviet Socialistic Republics is going to do the same thing for the same purpose, and thus down the line of the countries which are, or hope to be, militarily strong. There is, then, a promising market for concentrated foods, and pemmican still remains, in 1946, the leader in that field. World War II involved maneuvers of rapid advance and swift retreat, where men had to carry their own food and were not able to cook, the very conditions under which pemmican functions at the top of its qualifications. But the central consideration of the future is that while the role of the airplane grew in World War II, it will be paramount if there is a World War III. In any case, maintaining that readiness for war which has been said to be a guarantee of peace and world stability by Churchill and Montgomery, Roosevelt and Eisenhower, Stalin and Zhukov, will necessarily involve maintaining war technique at the highest level. Those guys did a great job of guaranteeing peace. Mass murderers. In any case, maintaining that readiness for war, which has been said to be a guarantee of peace and world stability by Churchill and Montgomery, Roosevelt and Eisenhower, Stalin and Zhukov, will necessarily involve maintaining war technique at the highest level. This means, among other things, the development of air transport and of those supplies, including foods, which are most readily carried by air. This is the time, then, to study pemmican, with other condensed foods, in relation to a military strength that depends on air transport. The following paragraphs examine, therefore, the theories and facts which apply to pemmican as a military ration. It has been suggested that in combat flying, an exclusive pemmican diet has a characteristic valuable to aviators in that it produces no gas within the intestines. For on mixed diets, high-altitude flyers complain of difficulty through the expansion of gas in the digestive tract that results in upward pressure against the diaphragm, causing discomfort that lessens fighting efficiency. In extreme cases, the pressure may interfere with heart action. For some, this trouble begins to be obtrusive at 16,000 or 17,000 feet, becoming serious above 20,000 feet. Footnote: in high-altitude flying, the expansion of gas in the circulatory system is more serious, the so-called bends. Against that condition, no special merits for pemmican are as yet claimed by even the most enthusiastic fans. End of footnote. It is of course true that to avoid gas in the intestinal tract, it is not necessary to use pemmican. The same result can be attained by an exclusive diet of fresh meat, using the lean and fat in the proportions desired by each person at a given meal. A flyer would have to confine himself to pemmican, or exclusive meat from another source, for about 3 days before a flight. In actual service, this would mean that he would have to be on the diet the whole time. No hardship to those who are used to it, but difficult for the first few days to inexperienced men of strongly established mixed food diet habits. Some Army physiologists, who believe in numerous advantages of a meat diet with a high fat content, nevertheless do not favor its use in high-altitude flying, which indicates a canceling disadvantage mitigating against the advantage of getting away from a carbohydrate diet that produces intestinal gases. It would seem that this difficulty has never been reported by balloonists who use pemmican, but it has been complained of by mountaineers as serious above 15,000 feet, for instance by Belmore Browne in his Conquest of Mount McKinley. A physiologist who has been in charge of instruction for high-altitude work in World War II puts it that if a high-fat, high-protein diet is fed to aviators, quote, immediately before as well as during flight, the capacity to tolerate oxygen lack and to work at high altitudes is reduced. On a high carbohydrate diet similarly taken, a definite increase in altitude tolerance is observed. The results are probably due to the fact that, in comparison with carbohydrates, proteins and fats require for use relatively larger amounts of oxygen, which is less available at high altitudes. End quote. In trench warfare, and in a number of other military situations, at moderate altitudes where oxygen is plentiful, there can be a considerable advantage in the low residue nature of pemmican, which reduces the frequency of bowel movement by several 100%. The period would be changed from once every day or two on a mixed diet to once every 5 to 8 days on an exclusive pemmican diet. This would also be of some post-operative importance in certain types of surgical cases. The feces of an exclusive meat eater, whether the diet is pemmican or fresh meat, are without disagreeable odor. Since this allegation is hard for many to believe, I refer again to the experience of Professor John C. Torrey, specialist in the study of intestinal flora at the Cornell Medical School of New York City, who has found this difference in comparing the feces of mixed diet eaters and those who live on exclusive meat. The mixed diets produce odors with which all are familiar and which few like. Dr. Torrey testifies that with meat eaters the odor is very slight and not disagreeable, being of an acid type, reminding of vinegar. Apart from the provisioning of war parties by the Plains Indians, the chief uses of buffalo pemmican were peaceful, to make possible the long journeys of the fur trade, and to store food from years of plenty against a time of scarcity. The campaigns of the United States Army against the Plains Indians did not come along until the buffalo pemmican era was near its end. Only in the Plains section of Canada did white troops use pemmican in campaigns against the Indians. But, apart from official adoption by white armies, recommendations for the military use of pemmican are traceable back more than a century. These derive from men who had lived in the buffalo country, from Texas to the Saskatchewan, and from others who had used caribou pemmican, thence north to Great Bear Lake. So far as I have discovered, the first man to recommend pemmican specifically for the use of armies was the famous overland traveler David Thompson, previously quoted. He described it in 1812 as, quote, "a wholesome, tasteful, nutritious food, upon which all persons engaged in the fur trade mostly depend for their subsistence during the open season." End quote. After a detailed and favorable discussion, he says, quote, "I have dwelt on the above, as it is the staple food of all persons, and affords the most nourishment in the least space and weight. It would be admirable provision for the army and navy." End quote. The second specific recommendation of pemmican as a military ration, which I have found, is in the previously referred to Ocean to Ocean by Dr. Grant. I have quoted at length what he wrote in 1872 concerning the use of pemmican during a hot weather journey, when his party was living almost exclusively on it. From these entries, which the reader has seen in their proper sequence, the remarks that bear on army use are now extracted and brought together. Quote, "Pemmican is good and palatable, uncooked and cooked. It has numerable other recommendations for a campaign diet. It keeps sound without being canned or salted for 20 or 30 years, is wholesome and strengthening, portable, and needs no medicine to correct a tried daily use of it. All joined in its praises as the right food for a journey, and wondered why the government had never used it in wartime. As an army marches on its stomach, condensed food is an important object for the commissariat to consider, especially when, as is the case of the British Army, long expeditions are frequently necessary." End quote. However, Thompson was a geographer and businessman. Grant was a doctor of divinity and a university president. From an army point of view, the recommendations of army men are more pertinent. We turn to them. As said, the Indian wars of the United States in the Prairie West came at the stage when the buffalo was disappearing, and with it the making of pemmican. So only a few army men had a chance to use this food. Some of them report that it did not taste particularly agreeable on first trial, but they usually add that you like it when you get used to it. In another connection, I have quoted Major J. W. Powell, veteran of the Civil War, who recommended pemmican as better than several other Indian foods, the use of which by white men was by then widespread. However, Powell was apparently thinking of it for civilian rather than army purposes. A soldier who made a special study of pemmican, using it and making inquiries about it, was Hiram Martin Chittenden, who graduated from West Point with the class of 1884, and, after a varied service, including the Spanish-American War, became a brigadier general in 1910, soon after which he was retired for physical disability. Both while in the army and later, Chittenden devoted his leisure to scholarship. He wrote several books which rank high, each in its own sphere. For example, his The American Fur Trade of the Far West, published in 1902, is generally recognized as the great work in the field. A full reprint was issued at New York in 1935, for the original had become scarce. I quote from Volume 2, pages 801 to 802. Quote, "It was not always, however, that the hunter or traveler had the buffalo with him, and it became necessary to provide in times of plenty against the times of deficiency. This was ordinarily done by the process of jerking or drying the meat. The Indians had another process of curing buffalo meat, equal, if not superior, to the most approved canning processes, and wholly free from the use of chemicals. This was the much used pemmican. It would last indefinitely, and was always ready for use without cooking. It formed a very palatable as well as nutritious food." End quote. Unlike those of the United States, Canada's military struggles with the Plains Indians came, as has been said, at a time when the buffalo, although no longer numerous within the territory of the United States, was still abundant where now are the prairie provinces, and where the Canadian government had those troubles with the Indians which are known as the Riel Rebellions. One of Canada's most distinguished soldiers received his training there. Major General Sir Samuel Benfield Steele, 1849 to 1919, had a military career throughout. Born at Purbrook, Ontario, he obtained a commission at the age of 17 as ensign in the 35th Regiment of the Militia. He served during the Fenian Raid of 1866 and in the Red River Expedition of 1870. The Canadian Encyclopedia says, quote, "In 1873 he became a troop sergeant major in the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, and in 1885 he became superintendent in command of this force. He commanded the cavalry during the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. During the South African War he commanded Strathcona's Horse, and from 1901 to 1906 he was in command of the South African Constabulary. In 1907 he returned to Canada, and in 1915 he was appointed to the command of the 2nd Canadian Contingent in the Great War, with rank of Major General. In 1916 he was made General Officer commanding the Shorncliffe area, and he died at London, England on January 30th, 1919. End quote. It may be that no soldier has ever been better qualified than Steele, by his own experience and by that of his associates, to judge Pemmican. He received his training far enough east so that Pemmican was unknown, or at least unused. He was not, therefore, habituated to it from childhood, as were some of the fur traders and explorers who have been quoted. He began to serve on the plains at the age of 21, and continued there until the beginning of the South African War, 1899. Thus he was familiar with the use of pemmican by the regular army, both Old Country British and Canadian, and by the Northwest Mounted Police, during the service of which he rose until he was its chief. During his African command of the famous Strathcona Cavalry in the Boer War, he became equally familiar with biltong, a ration as common there as pemmican was on the Canadian prairies. General Steele's 40 Years in Canada was published at Toronto in 1915. It contains a number of passing references to pemmican, and 2 comparatively extensive passages in chapters 5 and 6. In chapter 5, Steele has finished his years of apprenticeship on the plains that began with the Red River Expedition of 1870. He is now describing the organization of the Northwest Mounted Police, which later became the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, and still later the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The party had left Winnipeg and were traveling westerly across the prairies. Quote, "On the Salt Plain we met several brigades of carts driven by hunters, freighters, and traders, with packs of buffalo robes, dried meat, and pemmican. Inspector Jarvis bought a supply of pemmican, which is the best food in the world for the traveler, soldier, and sailor." End quote. In chapter 6, Steele is telling of the Edmonton country, the valley of the Saskatchewan. He describes a buffalo hunt, and then the manufacture of pemmican. Quote, "The winter hunt was for robes and meat, the spring and summer hunt for pemmican and dried meat. Pemmican would keep in perfect condition for decades. I do not know what the record is, but I have seen sacks of pemmican which had been worn smooth by transportation, not a hair being left, and yet it was as good as the best made within the year. It is first-class food for travelers, hunters, or soldiers, and, now that the buffalo no longer roam the plains, it can be made from the meat of the domestic animal, and is much superior to the biltong of South Africa." End quote. Major Frederick Russell Burnham, whom we have quoted a few pages back on the use of pemmican in the Boer War, confirmed in September 1945 that he is in agreement with General Steele's view on pemmican and biltong. The regular pemmican sources dried up when the buffalo disappeared. Thereafter beef pemmican was made for the mounted police on special occasions, notably a large quantity at the time of the Klondike Gold Rush, 1897 to 1899. Getting beef pemmican became increasingly difficult, and the quality deteriorated as the people died who had known how to make it from buffalo meat. Although the packing industry never took on the regular manufacture of pemmican, they made it up in small quantities at high prices for sportsmen and explorers, and usually or always on special order. The packers felt then, as they apparently still do, that in their general business they could make more money selling the ordinary salted and canned meats. With the development of transportation, weight and bulk of such things as canned corned beef ceased to be of consequence to the average buyer. Cans and salt meat do keep meat from spoiling, no matter how much water it contains. The explorers who needed pemmican grew fewer because the unknown lands were steadily contracting. The sportsmen who wanted pemmican grew fewer because their journeys were now shorter. There remained only one form of grand-scale human activity: war, in which it was still crucially important to have food that was light, compact, easy to preserve, and convenient to eat without utensils or cooking, if necessary. In battle, in a swift pursuit or retreat, a man still might have to carry his own food for several days. In case of siege, or for distant outposts, food might have to be transported by airplane. In crash landings, or on bailing out, where men might have to wait long for rescue or be forced to walk, it would be important to have a ration that would keep them strong for the longest time on the least weight. In ships of limited storage space, like destroyers and submarines, bulk and weight are also of consequence, and even more so with life rafts. It might be supposed, then, that the United States Army and Navy would have placed large orders for pemmican on the day after Pearl Harbor if they had failed to do so before. But this was not done, nor even a year after Pearl Harbor, and the few officers who were able to secure pemmican for the special use of their commands had to fight battles of red tape to get it. The reasons were numerous, but the chief trouble was that there had grown up a cult of modern dietetics, according to which pemmican is not a good food. As is common with disputes, the really serious difficulty on pemmican was that both factions were sincere, each with complete faith in its own kind of evidence. The controversy became so emotional and bitter that it has been called the Second Pemmican War. End of chapter 12. Next chapter, and the final chapter, 13, is the Second Pemmican War. It's a long one. The longest one, actually. I can't recall how interesting it is, to be honest, but I guess we'll find out. Let's see, do I have any thoughts to add to this? Well, let me just say that I can't really tell if Stephenson is speaking tongue-in-cheek, facetiously, about Christianity bringing about a love for our fellow man. Obviously, it hasn't done that, and it's not going to. This is one of those topics where it really has nothing to do with the book, and I could go on for a long time about it. I should really just make a separate video. But suffice it to say that Christianity is not only based on fairy tales that are not historical, but even worse, it was actually created as a deception, as a method of spiritual conquering, to get the people of the world to stop worshiping their ancestral deities and their ancestors, and to replace the gods of their particular tradition with the god of, let's just call them the bluish people, because if I use the other word, I might get censored. So hopefully you can figure out what I mean by bluish. It rhymes with bluish, and I'll say bluedeism instead of the other word. So basically, Christianity is bluedeism for non-blues. It's really very, very slightly different from bluedeism. It's pretty much the same thing. It's just the bluish people did not want Gentiles to convert or to consider themselves bluish, but they still wanted them to worship their God and to believe that they had some kind of special relationship with that God, the God of the universe that chose them. And so far, it's been working out pretty well for them. But anyway, back to Christianity being unifying or engendering universal love. That's obviously a laughable proposition, that it ever did that or that it ever will. Maybe for some people really took to heart the best passages of what Jesus allegedly said, this guy who never existed. But most people have fought over it. Most people have found differences over which they can murder each other. So that's really the history of Christianity. Murder, torture, guilt, fear, control, lies, manipulation, things of that sort. So what else? There was one other thing. I can't tell if he was being sarcastic or what his intention was when he said the thing about the United States intends to maintain a high pitch of military strength to safeguard the peace of the world. And the USSR is doing the same thing. And all the other countries who have huge militaries, which really aren't that many, but they're all doing it for peace, not to build an empire. I'm not sure if he really thought that that was the intention. Probably didn't live to witness the Korean War, I don't think. Didn't live to witness the Vietnam War. Didn't live to witness everything that has happened in Iraq and Libya and Iran and Syria and Pakistan and Afghanistan and Lebanon, Yemen, Nicaragua, Cuba. Really, that's actually a very small list. Oh, Palestine, let's not forget. There's so many more countries that... Oh, Ecuador. There's so many countries that the United States military has been used to destroy or topple the governments. Argentina, Chile, a lot of other Latin American countries. But anyway, he also says, in any case, maintaining that readiness for war, which has been said to be a guarantee of peace and world stability by Churchill and Montgomery, Roosevelt and Eisenhower, Stalin and Zhukov, will necessarily involve maintaining war technique at the highest levels. So he's saying that that's what people are saying. He's not saying, this is not his own opinion. And he doesn't really say if he agrees. So I can't tell his opinion. But apart from Montgomery and Zhukov, I don't know who those people are really. Sound familiar, but anyway, out of the 6, 4 of them, Churchill, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, and Stalin, are horrible, disgusting, mass-murdering, psychopathic douchebags who have no business receiving the respect of anybody or being given any kind of credence or weight or admiration. So if those people are saying that you need to maintain war technique at the highest level in order to guarantee peace, well, they're actually kind of correct. As far as self-defense is concerned, it does prevent, like martial arts. The whole point of learning martial arts is to prevent violence and avoid fighting, really. If people know that you can kick their ass, they won't try to fight you, and they won't try to hurt anyone who you care about. So the principle is sound to a certain extent, but it can also be used for bullying, and politicians generally are not of the first type. They're not of the I want to defend people I care about type. The Commander-in-Chief of the United States military for most of our history has not been someone who wants to use that power to defend the people of the United States whom he cares about so much. There might be a couple exceptions, but for the most part they want to use it to bully other countries into submission. So it would really be great if everyone had equal power to defend themselves, and there wasn't a hegemonic monopoly on the use of force by a few countries or one country. And the double standard is just disgusting. When America invades a country, it's wonderful, and it's to liberate them and to give them democracy, which is the most important thing. Never forget that gang rape is also democratic. So, how good is democracy really? Democracy is 2 wolves and a sheep deciding what's for dinner. But anyway, if America invades a country who does not want to be invaded, then we're liberators. But if Russia does it, they're evil. I'm not saying they're not evil, I'm just saying the double standard espoused by the media and politicians is astounding. Yeah, this has nothing to do with the book, but as I've said before, when the chapter is over, you can always turn off the video. You don't have to listen to me ramble. No one's forcing you. I try to avoid commentary during the book, and I think I've done a pretty good job of that. Every once in a while, I'll make a very short comment. I think I might have done it just like very, very few times. I try to save it for the end, so that people who just want the book can have just the book. And people who want to hear my personal thoughts, they can have them. The part about an all-meat diet causing less residue, In other words, you absorb more of what you're eating, so you excrete less of it, and so you need to make a bowel movement less often, and that being useful in cases of surgery where maybe you don't want to strain because it could rip stitches or something if you flex too hard. That was pretty interesting. I never really thought of that as an advantage, but it's true. A lot of people think that when I tell people I eat only meat and dairy, they're like, "Oh, you must be constipated." And I'm like, "No, definitely not. Very easy and regular. Don't worry about me." And the part about carbohydrates causing gas, I don't think it's really the carbohydrates so much as the fiber that is often associated. There are bacteria that live on fiber, and that's actually how a lot of animals get most of their nutrition, either by foregut fermentation or by hindgut fermentation, which is, in the case of ruminant animals like cows, for example, they have foregut, which means in front of the colon, in front of the intestines. They have a chamber called a rumen, which is full of bacteria that can turn fiber into fat. So actually, even though technically ruminant animals are herbivorous, they run mostly on fat. They're turning all of that grass into fat before they burn it for energy. And hindgut fermentation, in the case of most primates, for example, there's a thing called a cecum. And humans technically have one, but it's extremely small, so we're not capable of processing large volumes of fiber for energy, like a gorilla could, for example. Gorillas can eat 30 kilograms of fiber in a day. That's crazy. And they can only do it because they have a very large cecum, which is why their stomachs are so distended, they're so voluminous. So anyway, they have bacteria that are constantly feeding off of this fiber. And when you take fiber out of your diet, which is a very smart thing to do, by the way, and a lot of people think it's a very stupid thing to do, but that's because everyone has just about everything concerning nutrition ass backwards. And that's what I have made it my mission to correct to the extent that I can. Fiber. Look up Dr. Paul Mason, From Fiber to the Microbiome, Low Carb Gut Health. Maybe I'll even put the link in the description if I'm not feeling too lazy. But that video, and also a book called The Fiber Menace, MENACE, and the whole point was to say that no fiber means no food for the bacteria that consume fiber. And that's where gas comes from, for the most part. I barely ever fart now. It's usually when I eat fiber, which is pretty rare. And even when I do fart, it's not smelly anymore. I kind of miss having smelly farts. It's been a long time since I had one. I really can't remember last time. And it says right here, the feces of an exclusive meat eater, whether the diet is pemmican or fresh meat, are without disagreeable odor. So basically, my shit don't stink. Literally. Well, I guess that's it for this video. One more chapter, and we're done. Hope you have enjoyed this so far. Much love. But not because I'm a Christian. I do believe in God. I should make that distinction. I should clarify a little bit my theological position. I'm a theist, and I don't know if there's one God or a million gods, but there's something smarter than humans, because biology is essentially a bunch of very complex mechanisms that could not possibly have happened by accident. Ferraris don't happen by accident. Rolex watches don't happen by accident. Something like a cell cannot happen by accident. Logically, that seems like very sound logic to me. And also, I've had some experiences with plant medicines where I've met what you might call spirits or gods. But anyway, I do not worship the God of the bluish people, which is also the God of the Christian people and the Muslim people. That God might exist, but I do not worship it, and I do not respect it, and I do not fear it. Although maybe I should, just because of all the havoc it has wreaked over the last few thousand years, if it does in fact exist. But I know that that God wants me to fear it, So just out of spite, I am going to not fear it. Maybe some of the Hindu gods exist. Maybe some of them are pretty cool. I don't know. Maybe everyone has it wrong. Maybe no one has any idea. And the real God has never been in contact with any human. I don't know. Or maybe the ones that I met were like demigods. You know, they weren't the supreme commander. They weren't the commander-in-chief. Maybe they were colonels or generals or something. But anyway, there's definitely some kind of spiritual world. There's definitely a lot more going on beyond our field of vision. A lot of vibrations occurring that we can't perceive. There's so much, I mean, just between audio, which is like 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, or 20 kilohertz, however you want to say it. There's so many frequencies in between there and vision. I can't remember what the range of vision is, but that's also a very small spectrum. And there's infrared and UV and gamma, and there's just so many levels. Wi-Fi, 5G. So just because you can't see the angel on your shoulder or the demon on the other shoulder doesn't mean they're not there. That's why I got this tattoo. There's more to the picture than meets the eye. It's both literal and metaphorical. Like, literally our eyes are not seeing everything that is happening in the physical world. But then also, like, figuratively speaking, you don't know everything about a person. When you meet them, you might know them your whole life, and you still don't see everything. And much less so when you have just met someone. So remember that. And in any situation, you might not see what's going on, the full extent of your circumstances, all the details, all the context. Anyway, the spread of Christianity was to create a universal love of man for his fellow. Well, that didn't happen, but I do think it is possible, and I think it's necessary even. And I think that is why atheism is really a hindrance to progress, just as much as the Abrahamic religions are, if not more, because at least if you believe in an Abrahamic religion, you believe in a God, and then you can believe that everyone is a child of God, and then treat them as such. But atheism is like, yeah, you're just an accident. You're just a monkey's uncle. You're just the great-great-grandchild of some pond scum. And we're not brothers and sisters because we don't have a spiritual father or mother. So I think it's important to be a theist as much as it's important to not be bluish or Christian or Muslim. Those are all nonsense. Such nonsense. I don't mean to insult anybody, but I'd be happy to debate you. I hope this doesn't turn you off from this information. It has nothing to do with the book. So, but yeah, I mean, it's just fairy tales. And fairy tales can be entertaining and they can teach you a moral lesson, but you shouldn't take them literally. You shouldn't believe in them as being historical. And it would just take way too long to go into detail about each individual religion and why they're ridiculous nonsense. So I won't do it, but I could. Oh, I could. But I do think it's possible for us to have a religion, if you want to call it that, or just a philosophy that includes a universal love of man for his fellow. You can have that without Jesus. Just because Jesus said it doesn't mean someone else can't say it. I'm saying it. You should have a universal love of man. That's it. Don't worship me as your savior. Don't drink my blood. Don't eat my body. Don't kill anybody. Don't start a war because you think someone else's interpretation of my teaching is better or worse. Just love each other and don't turn the other cheek. If someone hits you, hit them back. If someone hits you, hit them back. If someone steals your coat, do not give them your cloak. They will take advantage of you. These are subversive teachings. Jesus was subversive. Not that he existed, but his teachings, the teachings that are attributed to him, for the most part, are subversive. Love your enemy, hate your family. If someone hits you, just take it. That makes you superior. That makes you good. Complete nonsense. If someone steals your coat, give him your cloak. This doesn't make any sense. I used to think it did, because it made me feel like rejecting my natural instincts was some grand expression of morality. If you look at a woman and you find her attractive, oh, you've already committed adultery. That's nonsense. And no one practices Christianity anyway. No one sells all of their belongings. No one takes out their eye if they look at a woman lustfully. Pop, oop, I better do that before. Alright, enough theological discourse for today. Short chapter, long ramble. I'll catch you on the next one. Much love. Peace.